What you are watching unfold in real time, Iranian missiles arcing toward Tel Aviv, air defense batteries pushed to their operational limits, Western capitals scrambling for a narrative, is not a crisis. It is a system working exactly as designed. And in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you the financial and military architecture behind what you think you are watching on the news. Because the gap between what is being reported and what is actually happening is so vast, so deliberately constructed, that by the time we are done here, you will never be able to watch a Middle East news cycle the same way again. Let me be precise about what I mean.
When Iran launches a fourth missile wave toward Tel Aviv, the immediate media reflex is to reach for the vocabulary of escalation, of crisis, of dangerous miscalculation. Every anchor on every major network begins performing the same ritual: maps, missile trajectories, casualty counts, urgent commentary from think tank fellows who rotate between the Council on Foreign Relations and the Pentagon advisory boards with the ease of a revolving door that has never once stopped turning. What they do not do, what they are structurally incapable of doing within the framework of corporate media, is ask the foundational question: who benefits from a Middle East that is permanently on fire? Not rhetorically, financially, institutionally. Follow the money, and you will find that the missiles, the counterstrikes, the humanitarian emergencies, and the peace processes that never quite arrive are all, every single one of them, components of a revenue-generating, dollar-sustaining, empire-maintaining machine that has been running without interruption since 1973.
I want to start with the architecture because that is where most analysts fail. They look at events, a missile strike here, a drone attack there, a resolution vetoed at the Security Council, and they analyze the events as if events were the story. They are not. The events are the surface. Underneath the surface is a structure, and that structure has three interlocking pillars: the petrodollar system, the arms export economy, and the IMF World Bank debt dependency model. Remove any one of those three pillars, and the entire edifice of American global dominance begins to shake. This is not a metaphor. It is a balance sheet reality. And Iran, whether its leadership fully articulates it in these terms or not, represents a direct challenge to all three pillars simultaneously. That is why Iran cannot be allowed to stabilize. That is why every attempt at a diplomatic settlement gets sabotaged.
Not because American policymakers are irrational, because they are, from the standpoint of maintaining the system, entirely rational. Let me take you back to where this architecture was built, because you cannot understand the present without understanding 1971 and 1973. In August of 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. The United States unilaterally ended the Bretton Woods Agreement, telling the world that it would no longer redeem dollars for gold at $35 an ounce. This was, in the most clinical sense, a default. The United States defaulted on its international financial obligations. And what I argued in Super Imperialism, which I published that same year, and which was subsequently used as a manual by the US Treasury Department, a fact that still strikes me as one of the great dark ironies of my career, was that this default was not a retreat. It was an advance.
By severing the dollar from gold, the United States freed itself to run permanent deficits without ever having to settle them in anything of real value. Foreign governments that earn dollars through trade surpluses could do only one thing with those dollars: buy US Treasury bonds. They had become, without quite realizing it, the involuntary financiers of American military spending. But there was still a problem. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, what was it backed by? The answer came in 1973 through a negotiation that Henry Kissinger conducted with the Saudi royal family, the details of which were kept classified for decades. The deal was elegant in its brutality. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars, and OPEC would follow.
In exchange, the United States would guarantee the security of the Saudi regime, which meant in practice that the US military would serve as the private security force for the House of Saud. The petrodollar system was born, and from that moment forward, every country in the world that needed to buy oil, which is to say every country in the world, needed to first acquire US dollars. The demand for dollars was no longer a function of American economic productivity. It was a function of military arrangement. The dollar was now backed by oil and by the guns that protected the oil. Keep watching, because what I am about to explain is the mechanism that makes the current Iranian missile crisis not just comprehensible, but inevitable. And it involves a number that most economists are still too polite to say out loud.
The number is this. The United States currently runs a military budget of approximately $850 billion per year in official figures, with the real total, once you include Veterans Affairs, intelligence agencies, nuclear weapons maintenance under the Department of Energy, and the interest on debt accumulated from previous wars, well north of $1 trillion annually. This is not a defense budget. No country on earth threatens the continental United States in a way that would require $1 trillion a year to deter. What that budget funds is not defense, it is presence. Bases in 140 countries, naval carrier groups in every major ocean, the capacity to project force anywhere on the planet within hours. It is, in the most literal sense, the overhead cost of running a global empire. And empires are expensive. The question is always, who pays? The answer under the petrodollar system is that the world pays. Every nation that holds dollar reserves, and they hold them because they must, because oil is priced in dollars, because international trade is denominated in dollars, because the IMF demands dollar-denominated repayment on its loans. Every one of those nations is in effect paying a tribute to Washington. Not a tribute that appears on any invoice, not a tribute that any finance minister will acknowledge in public, but a tribute nonetheless, visible in the gap between the goods and services the United States imports and the paper dollars it exports in return. I have called this, for 50 years, the ultimate free lunch. The United States prints dollars, the world sends real goods in exchange. The world then lends those dollars back to Washington by buying treasury bonds. And Washington uses the borrowed dollars to fund the military that enforces the system that makes the dollar indispensable. Now, where does Iran fit into this machine? Iran fits in as the wrench, as the country that more than any other in the current period has the combination of resources, regional influence, ideological independence, and geopolitical alignment through its deepening partnership with Russia and China to actually throw that wrench into the gears. And that is a fact that has nothing to do with the Iranian government's domestic human rights record, nothing to do with the theology of its revolutionary leadership, and everything to do with the structural threat it poses to dollar hegemony. When I say this, I am not defending the Iranian government. I am doing something the mainstream commentators systematically refuse to do. I am analyzing the geometry of imperial interests without the moral camouflage. Iran sits on approximately 157 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the fourth largest in the world. It has a population of 85 million, a significant industrial base relative to its neighbors, a sophisticated missile program developed precisely because it has been under sanctions that prevented it from acquiring conventional Western weapon systems, and it shares borders or close proximity with Iraq, Afghanistan, the Gulf states, Turkey, and the Caucasus. It is, in strategic terms, the keystone of the Middle East arch. Control Iran, and you control the regional security environment. Lose Iran, which the United States effectively did in 1979, and you have a permanent problem at the center of the most oil-rich geography on Earth. But here is what has changed since 1979. And this is where the current missile exchange becomes something qualitatively different from the crises that preceded it. Iran is no longer isolated. Iran has joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran has formalized its partnership with China through a 25-year cooperation agreement signed in 2021 that involves Chinese investment in Iranian oil infrastructure in exchange for preferential crude supply outside the dollar system. Iran has deepened its military and energy cooperation with Russia to a degree that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. And Iran is actively engaged with the BRICS framework, which now represents, measured by purchasing power parity, a larger share of global economic output than the G7. What is being built, slowly, imperfectly, but unmistakably, is an alternative architecture.
An architecture in which oil does not have to be priced in dollars, in which infrastructure finance does not have to flow through the World Bank, in which central banks can hold reserves in currencies other than the dollar and settle trade through mechanisms that bypass SWIFT. This is not a small thing. This is an existential threat to the system I described, the system where the world involuntarily finances American military supremacy, and the American foreign policy establishment, whatever its public statements about Iranian nuclear ambitions or regional terrorism, understands this at the level of institutional reflex. You do not need a conspiracy to explain the policy. You need only to follow the structural interest. When a country moves to exit the dollar system, it gets sanctioned. When it persists despite sanctions, it gets destabilized. When destabilization proves insufficient, it gets bombed. We watched this with Libya. We watched this with Iraq. We are watching it in a more complicated and dangerous form with Iran.
And now stay with me, because what I'm going to show you in the next section of this analysis is the part that even most critics of American foreign policy miss entirely: the domestic financial feedback loop that makes the continuation of Middle East conflict not just politically convenient, but economically necessary for specific and identifiable sectors of the American economy. The loop that ensures that every missile fired, every defense battery activated, every square kilometer of urban infrastructure reduced to rubble generates a financial return that flows back with extraordinary precision to a set of institutions and individuals whose names you would recognize from any list of major political donors. This is not capitalism behaving badly. This is capitalism behaving exactly as its internal logic demands. And once you see the mechanism clearly, you cannot unsee it.
Let me name the mechanism directly. When Iran fires a fourth missile wave and Israeli air defense systems begin burning through their interceptor inventories, the first phone calls made in Washington are not to diplomats. They are to procurement officers. Every Iron Dome interceptor costs approximately $50,000. Every David Sling missile runs between $1 and $2 million. Every Arrow 3 intercept costs somewhere between $2 and $3 million per shot. A sustained missile exchange of the scale we are currently witnessing can burn through hundreds of millions of dollars in interceptor inventory in a single night. That inventory must be replenished. The contracts to replenish it flow to Raytheon, to Lockheed Martin, to Boeing, to RTX Corporation. Those companies' stock prices rise in real time as the missiles fly. I am not being poetic. This is a documented, measurable, publicly observable financial phenomenon. Defense sector indices spike within hours of major Middle East escalations. Wall Street has built trading algorithms that front-run geopolitical violence. The missiles are, in the most precise accounting sense, a demand generation mechanism for the American defense industry.
But the arms sales are only the most visible layer. Beneath them is the bond market dynamic. When the Middle East destabilizes, global capital flees to safety. And safety, in the current monetary architecture, means US Treasury bonds. Every regional war, every spike in oil price uncertainty, every threat to Gulf shipping lanes triggers a capital inflow into dollar-denominated assets that suppresses American borrowing costs and allows Washington to continue funding its deficit at rates that would otherwise be unsustainable. The instability is the product. The crisis is the advertisement. What is being sold is the dollar as the only safe harbor in a dangerous world, a world that American foreign policy works systematically to keep dangerous enough to sustain that demand. Israel functions within this architecture not as an independent actor pursuing its own irrational aggression, but as a forward deployed node of American strategic infrastructure.
This is not an anti-Israel argument, it is a structural observation. Israel receives approximately $3.8 billion annually in direct military assistance that must, by the terms of the agreement, be spent on American weapon systems. Israel is simultaneously a testing ground for American weapons technology, a regional intelligence platform, and the one actor in the Middle East whose security guarantee Washington has made unconditional. That unconditional guarantee is not sentimentality. It is load-bearing. It is what gives the United States its permanent justification for military presence, for carrier groups in the Eastern Mediterranean, for bases in Bahrain and Qatar and Kuwait. Remove the permanent crisis around Israel, and the military rationale for that presence weakens. The presence is what enforces the petrodollar order. You begin to see how tightly the architecture fits together.
What the fourth Iranian missile wave represents in this framework is not Iranian aggression. It is the response of a state that has been under economic siege for 40 years, that has watched the United States assassinate its top military commander on Iraqi soil in 2020 in an act of state violence that would have been called an act of war if any other country had done it, and that has correctly identified, as I have argued since the 1970s, that the only language the imperial system responds to is the language of cost imposition. Iran is making the maintenance of the current order more expensive.
That is its strategic logic. And the tragedy, the real tragedy, is that the populations absorbing the consequences of this logic, Israeli civilians, Iranian civilians, Lebanese civilians, Palestinian civilians, are paying in blood for a financial architecture whose primary beneficiaries sit in boardrooms in Arlington and Houston and Lower Manhattan, as far from the missile trajectories as it is possible to get. The dollar system is cracking, not collapsing, I want to be precise, but cracking. The BRICS expansion, the Chinese yuan oil contracts, the Russian pivot to non-dollar settlement, the Global South's growing refusal to accept IMF conditionality without protest. These are the real strategic context within which every missile fired in the Middle East must be understood. The more the multipolar alternative develops, the more desperate and the more violent the defense of the unipolar order will become. What you are watching over Tel Aviv is not the beginning of a new conflict. It is the intensifying death rattle of an old system that has run out of legitimate tools and has only the tools of force remaining. And history, as I've spent my career documenting, tells us exactly what happens next.